This is Product by Design, a podcast by Prodigy, where we explore technology, artificial intelligence, user experience, product management, and the philosophy of building products and companies. Welcome back to another episode of Product by Design. I am Kyle, and this week we have another awesome guest with us, Curt Schreiber. Curt, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Kyle. It's great to be here.
Well, let me do a quick introduction of you, Curt, and then we'll let you expand on that and dive into a number of questions. But Curt is the Chief Creative Officer at VSA Partners, a brand-led customer experience agency that works with companies like Nike, IBM, and Harley Davidson. And throughout his career, Curt has been honored by several design and communication organizations such as AIGA and Cannes Lions. I don't even know, Cannes and Cooper Hewitt. So you'll have to tell me how to pronounce that one.
Yeah, it's just sort of like Con, C-O-N is what you pronounce. I know, it always
Con
screws me up. Yeah.
Well, Curt, again, I'm really, really excited. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Thanks, Kyle. I'm I've always been an admirer of art and design growing up. And so, over the years, my design experience has spanned many mediums. I've done retail design and investor communications, and packaging, even corporate interiors, museum experiences. And of course, now it's primarily brand systems. That's what I spend most of my time on today. And VSA has become really well known for that.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to dive into a number of the different experiences that you've mentioned. But before we do that, why don't you tell us a little bit about what you like to do outside of the office?
Well, outside of the office, it's I don't spend much time outside of the office. I work a lot, and I love working. So, but the other thing I do, I have a hobby. I have a couple of hobbies. But I do like gardening and cooking, especially. And when I really want to hit the outdoors, I downhill ski and also ride motorcycles.
Awesome. Those are some great hobbies. And I know we'll talk a little bit more, especially about some of the motorcycles as we go through. But I want to dive into a little bit more about your experience. So maybe tell us a little bit more about your journey and what brought you to VSA and into your current role. Well,
like I said, I've always appreciated art and design, and oftentimes people will use those terms interchangeably. But I think one thing that I pay a lot of attention to are actually the differences between art and design. For the most part, artists create to express themselves, and designers create for someone else. And so as a role, in my role as a designer, there's certainly an art form to what I do. There's actually, beauty and attractiveness is a really important part of my job. But I really view the designer's role as establishing a real strong relationship with the client. It's like one of the most important parts of my job. And that's something I've got a great passion for. And primarily because of my experience has been that great relationships lead to great work. It's also helpful in running a successful business.
Yeah, definitely. I'm interested in maybe some of that overlap between the art and the design, because I like that distinction that you made that, artists kind of create for themselves and designers are creating really for someone else. How much have you found there is art in the design that you do and vice versa?
Well, if you just think about like core sort of principles or elements of art and design, there's color theory, composition. There are materials that are similar as well. So kind of, some of the actually tools now as well. I mean, artists are using, computers and computer-aided design tools to create their works of art. But I think that when you look at kind of the thinking and the tools, the methodologies, and the components of what both the artist and the designer do. That has a lot of overlap, but it's like the purpose or the intention of the creation. One is to express, when I say themselves, it's an idea or it's a principle or it's a belief they may have. But designers are really problem solvers. And what that means is you're solving for the problems, for someone else's problems.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it, and great to highlight some of the overlaps, because I think that they're definitely there. You mentioned, and I mentioned at the beginning, you've worked with a lot of different brands. What have been some of the biggest lessons that you've learned in working with some of these large and well-known brands, or even maybe some of the lesser known brands that you've worked with?
Yeah, well, I've had so many mentors and so many great collaborators over the years. But one lesson that comes to mind is when I learned working with the Davidson family, the Harley Davidson family. And for over a decade, we did some tremendous work, dealership design, all types of marketing and communications and event design. So it was really a pretty amazing experience. And arguably, Harley Davidson's one of the best brands on the planet. But in working with Willie G, who is the great grandson, he was designing motorcycles at that time. So his primary job was to design the bikes, and he had this really interesting kind of secret to what the way he approached his work. And I think if you're a motorcycle enthusiast, you know the V-twin, right? It has an iconic shape, and of course Harley is really well known for its sounds. It comes from the V-twin and pipes and stuff like that. But what makes that V-twin so special in the intention of the design is the space that Willie would leave around the V-twin. And so you could sort of see the engine, but you could also see the space around the engine in terms of the frame of the bike and other, and the tank and other components that rested closely to it. But that white space actually frames it, and it puts the engine on display. And so, when he described that technique to me, I was very early. I was probably just a few years out of college at the time. But what isn't there is oftentimes as important as what's actually there. And I think it's a really great lesson. It's one that I use all the time. I think of it as just reduction.
I think that's so good. Being just like you said, what isn't there is just as important as what is there in design, because it can frame, or it can allow for those different feelings or visuals that you're trying to create. I'm interested because you mentioned, not just the design of Harley, of the motorcycles, but also a variety of different designs. So design of the showrooms and design of some of the other assets or aspects of Harley Davidson. What was that like working on the design of some of those different things?
Well, there was, the retail design is really interesting because Harley doesn't own any dealerships yet. It has like 600 or 800 of them across the country. And so they're all independently owned. And of course, in the 80s and the 90s, Harleys got incredibly popular, maybe up to 2000, 2010. So these dealers were building these massive dealerships, and some were on brand and some maybe were off brand. And so a big part of what I did at that time was develop a system so it could be universally embraced across all dealerships. Well, one thing that we did, which I thought was particularly interesting, was to, with a retail environment, especially a dealership, you can spot a dealership from miles away because of its signage. And so when we thought about the principles of this dealership design, we wanted to make sure the Harley Davidson brand, the idea of the company, the experience that you're anticipating, arrives at every step along the way as you come closer and as you enter and experience the dealership itself. So from a mile away, from a block away, standing outside the front door, looking into the windows, as you pass through the door, what is the first thing you experience? And then as you gradually make your way through the store, it's like down to every single detail, every single hang tag. What is the Harley Davidson experience and how is it uniquely them? So, lots of learnings from the retail experience in particular.
I think that that's so good because it really comes down, like you're talking about, to the overall experience and this really can go for anything, from going into a showroom or a dealership, or, the experience that you have coming into, whether it's a product or software or anything, really taking into account all of those different pieces, experiencing it from the outside. And then when you're there, and then when you're coming into it, and then all throughout, because all of those things are part of the customer journey or the user experience, and really thinking through what all of that looks like. And I think that's a great illustration of it, the dealership part, because it's a very physical, a thing that you're doing, but it's so applicable to so many other areas of design.
Totally. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, when we were working with Brand Jordan on some materials years ago, one of the things that the team that designs the shoe embraced was that, when you design a Nike sneaker for Michael Jordan, you want to be able to, if you're in the third, section of the stands, you want to be able to look down onto the court, and you want to be able to see something iconic about that shoe. You want to be able to recognize that shoe from afar. And then as you come closer and as you hold the shoe in your hand, there are levels of detail that you come to appreciate as well.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. The whole experience. I'm interested in your perspective, as you've worked with many brands. What makes a good brand?
Well, it's a good question. Branding is like principally what we do. We do a lot of stuff, but we do a lot of branding, and companies come to us at different stages, and sometimes the brand is strong, sometimes it isn't, and it needs to be stronger. But I've always felt like a good brand starts by knowing who they are, what they stand for, what they believe, what guides them, their North Star, so to speak. But I think brands that have a higher level of confidence in who they are and what they believe ultimately are stronger brands in the marketplace. That's a good start, I should say. I sometimes think of this as brand purpose or brand character. But then I think great brands take it one step further. I think that, the closer you can align your promise, the promise that a brand makes, and the actual experience or how the brand actually performs, the closer that's aligned, the stronger your brand is. Now, so it's not about like always being premium, because you can be premium and you can underdeliver and you can disappoint. Airlines is a really good example. Like I think about airlines a lot, and obviously I fly a lot, but like Spirit Airlines and Southwest Airlines promises a certain level of experience. That's its promise, and that's a level of experience that you actually get. So those end up being very, very strong brands. I think there are other airlines that promise a more premium experience, and then they have difficulty fulfilling that experience. So it's not about sort of price point. It's about what you promise and how closely that aligns with the actual experience.
I think that is such a good point, where you have the alignment between the promise or the expectations, and then what's actually being delivered and the experience that a user has. So you can create a really good, good logos and good design and all of those things. But if that's if ultimately like the user or the customer isn't experiencing it in the way that they expect, you don't really have a good brand. And I think the airlines are an amazing example of that, because you have ones that like Southwest that have such a strong reputation and a strong brand and deliver on that. And then you have others that you are constantly disappointed in because they have a certain level of branding or experience that you expect, and you almost too frequently you're not getting that, and that's where the disconnect is. I think that's incredibly good. Going along those lines, how do you build a brand? How do you create this alignment between the vision that you have, the North Star, and then the experience?
Well, I typically, if you're building a brand or you're rebuilding a brand, or I think that's, I oftentimes start with this, like an iconic attribute. And there's something about everybody that's uniquely them. And so you have to find out what that is. You have to discover it. And sometimes it's a series of moments or a single moment in your history. Other times it's something visual about your product, or it's a functional attribute that has been consistently deployed over time. Sometimes you can build a brand on a service offering or even a warranty. So there are many things that you can choose from, but I think to build a brand, a powerful brand, it needs to be iconic and authentically you. Now, that alone isn't enough. It's a good start, but when I think about brands, and they need to be relevant, and so user needs, culture, our society it's constantly evolving and changing, and so how your brand shows up and the conversations you have, the engagements that you have, the experiences that you have need to be relevant and integrated into people's lives. It's like, okay, so you have a great brand. Why do I care about it? Right. So those two things are things that I focus on when building brand.
I love that. And it makes so much sense, the connection between those two. I'm curious along those same lines, because you mentioned it, what happens when you're really looking to pivot or change a brand identity or rebrand? How do you approach that? And how should a company or a brand think about that as well?
Well, pivoting, so that's also kind of a big part of what we do. I mean, most of our work comes from Fortune 100s and those alike, number one, number two brands in the category, sometimes number threes. And so there's all kinds of ways you can start to think about pivoting, why change an identity, why change your expression. But I think that one easy way to think about it is you can separate brandings into two categories: the founder's moment, right? Companies starting up, or the refounding moment. And the refounding moments to us are really, really interesting because they can happen time and time again over the life cycle of a brand, and for many reasons. Mergers, expansion into new geographies or new demographics. It can happen because you've gone IPO. Perhaps that company has had a near-death experience, and but it's found its way. It's got the opportunity for renewed life. So those refounding moments are a time to pivot. And when you change your brand identity or brand expression, it really does signal to the world that something is different about this organization. Something has changed. So I find those to be really interesting moments, and ones that I think companies can really capitalize on when done right. I do, Kyle. I have a recent example of work we did for a company with a near-death experience. Would you like me to share that?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Actually, it's so interesting because there are lots of companies that had near-death experiences. Harley almost had a near-death experience, in its days at AMF. IBM had its own near-death experience when, during the breakup. So, but one that I love to use an example. We engaged with Converse, the footwear company, back at the time when they had totally lost their monopoly around 2010 or so. I think about that time when we engaged 2008. But from the 70s to the 2000s, they just plummeted. Nike, Adidas, Puma were all eating their lunch. They, Brand Jordan even, obviously, and the company was near bankruptcy. And then investors and these two gentlemen, Jack Boys and Dave Maddox, partnered, chose to work with VSA to help reestablish their brand expression at the same time that they were retooling their product, establishing all new creative relationships and new retail strategies. And so much was going on inside the company to reestablish it. And at the same time, interestingly enough, Nike went on to buy Converse, which they still own Converse today. But the brand refresh was a way to really signal that something different was happening in the organization. And that effort, their effort, really helped to reclaim their dominance in footwear. They made the decision to stand for rebellion and optimism at the same time. I think you could see that in the brand today, but they're really celebrating a music, sport, art and fashion. And they ultimately became Nike's number one performing subsidiary or sub-brand for a very long period of time.
I love that because I think it speaks so much to how you can go about making some of these big changes. I'm interested too, because, obviously there's the initial branding and, some of these potential big changes. How have you found or advised or helped the people that you work with maybe stay relevant as the world changes, as things change, maybe not necessarily with an entire new brand expression, but with pivoting maybe some of the messaging or pivoting some of the focus in order to adjust maybe what is a brand that's working, not do an entire rebrand, but to continually stay fresh and relevant as things change?
Well, I think you look to culture. You look to culture and new things that are coming on the scene in music or in art. You look to technology as well, and technology is. Right now it's like it's AI. AI has been around for a long time, and AI has been incorporated in so much of what we do today already. But it's been sort of behind the scenes, and all of a sudden it became front and center not too long ago, and so everyone's kind of crazy about it. But it is going to kind of reshape a lot. So I think those two things, culture and technology. And so if you're on top of culture and you're on top of technology, those two things can make a huge impact on your brand and staying relevant.
We've obviously seen a massive shift in technology over this past year, with, like you said, it's something that has been behind the scenes and incorporated into a lot of technology, but now has kind of exploded it into the forefront of everyone's mind and the discussion and where technology is going. And so being able to stay relevant and updated with those things while staying, true to maybe what is the original North Star or the way that you're branded, but being able to shift as culture changes, as technology changes, in order to either to capture that moment or to just continue to kind of put that forward and adjust and change.
Yeah.
I'm interested, managing and working with stakeholders is such an important part of what so many of us do. And certainly what you do in design and experience. And part of what you mentioned before is this idea of stakeholder design. What is that, and why is working closely with stakeholders so important?
Well, there's actually, Kyle, a lot going on in this area right now. And I'll kind of go into sort of like what's happening, but just looking back, there were two kind of, I would say really, really big movements in the past 50 years. And so first there was Friedman's view of the purpose of a corporation. And Friedman had this view that CEOs and board of directors across all businesses embraced. That was this idea that the purpose of a corporation was to increase its profits. And the primary stakeholder was the investor. And that view has largely held true even to today. And the second kind of major movement, which I think was probably more or less probably IDEO, actually, the design firm IDEO, and their team who put, from a design standpoint, they put the user at the center, right? So corporations were putting the shareholder at the center, and, designers in the 80s and 90s started putting the user at the center. So the user experience. Now, so those are two really big movements, and arguably there are probably a few other ones. But I think that in the past, people have, or corporations or brands, they've had to choose, or their temptation is to choose one stakeholder and go all in. And I think that's changing. And we see it changing right now all around us, because today companies have much broader responsibilities and a whole range of stakeholders. So, for instance, employees today, more important than ever. Customers, obviously, have always been important. The society at large, Mother Nature, the environment has become a really critical stakeholder. Business partners, even politicians, and society. So it's and what's interesting is corporations are having to juggle all of these stakeholder needs, stakeholder demands sometimes. And what's challenging is oftentimes they have opposing views, right? So employees want one thing, customers want another, business partners may be looking for something different. And so they find, businesses oftentimes find themselves kind of caught in the middle. We see that today right now, unfortunately, with like Bud Light or Target or Disney. They find themselves, in the middle of these opposing stakeholder views. And so I think that one of the things that corporations and brands need to do today are design new methods for managing and innovating across the multi-stakeholder landscape.
Yeah, you've brought up some really, really good points, and especially as these brands and organizations are now balancing more than just the shareholder, like you mentioned, or the investor, which I think is so important because there's so many more constituents and stakeholders to take into account, and that impact companies and impact all of us, the world at large. What happens when you have these opposing views and you have these maybe even completely opposite desires from one stakeholder group versus another? How do you go about balancing those?
It's interesting. I've been working a little bit with Yale and John Iwata, former CMO of IBM, and they're working on curriculum and they're developing methods and models for stakeholder innovation and management. And so it's something that there's increasing interest and lots of ideas in terms of how you might go about doing this. Not just managing, but also like innovating. Or it's not like crisis management. At times it is, but it's so much more. And so folks are really working hard right now at trying to sort out the best methods for balancing opposing needs. But one thought that we have discussed around this topic is, do you remember the scene in Apollo 13? Square peg in a round hole, the carbon dioxide filter on the spacecraft, it needs to be fixed. And they only have, we need to make this fit into the whole of this with nothing but this. And they dump the box of parts out on the table. And what that is, that's a demonstration, exercise in constraint. And so, part of this is about embracing constraint and looking at each of these audience segments and looking at which ones of those can be conjoined. And so, businesses kind of intuitively do this at times. And there's lots of examples, Nike has examples, American Express in the past, but there are also companies today that are looking at, embracing this way of thinking. It actually starts with, just like Apollo 13, you have to assemble this cross-functional team. And as I mentioned before, when you look at these audiences, corporations are like, they're siloed around those audiences. So HR is serving employee needs, sales are serving customers, procurement, business partners, marketing, future customers, product development, investor relations, investors. So corporations are siloed around these audiences. And so innovation happens when you start, working together. And I don't think of this as, designed by committee. It's designed by constraints, by embracing those constraints that each of those constituents might have.
I love that. The idea of design by constraint and really embracing those constraints as a means to create the best potential outcome or the best potential experience for users. And I love the scene in Apollo 13. I can't even count the number of times I've seen that movie. It has been one of my favorites. And this idea of, here are the tools that we have. Here's what we need to accomplish. And, in that case, it was life and death. We have to make this fit. Otherwise, we're not, they won't make it and we won't bring them home. And obviously in our circumstances, it's not necessarily life and death situations, but it's still embracing those constraints. Here's what we have. And that ultimately, kind of like I think you mentioned, allows us to create oftentimes better experiences when we have, here's what we need to do and here's what we have to work with, because there's not this anything goes or any we can do absolutely anything. It's we have a very set a number of set constraints, and working within that, I've found often produces some of the best, most creative solutions, rather than not imposing those constraints on ourselves. What has been some of your experience as you've done this, or as you've helped brands and companies do that?
Well, relative to constraint, you're faced with constraints all the time. And I completely agree with you. Sometimes the best creative solutions can come out of constraint because it forces you to think about something differently. And when you think about it differently, you oftentimes arrive at a different type of solution. But, the obvious constraints are, time, cost, material, and those constraints are real. I think that designers and marketers and product, designers experience those types of constraints all the time. And but there are also, I think, other types of constraints, especially when you're kind of navigating, the corporate environment. It's like, approvals, buy-in. There are other types of constraints that. I don't know, Kyle, if I'm answering the question you wanted me to answer. But I think that, you're sort of like, you're forced to, willingly accept constraints. I often am. I think, when you have something like a blue sky, when it's like, anything goes, it's like, okay, well, I'm not, it's like we can go anywhere, it's like, but, so, when you set a parameter, the person, the designer who's like legendary for constraints was, Ray and Charles Eames, that design duo. They, cause, you're manufacturing things like chairs and stuff like that. Chairs got to be at a certain price point. You have to use certain materials. It has to be assembled in a certain way. It has to be designed in a way that could be maybe stacked or shipped or stored. So I think that constraint has been something that designers have been embracing for some time, and I think that it can be used as a new design tool, even though it's been embraced for decades.
I love that. And I think it makes perfect sense embracing those constraints and the number of constraints that we potentially have in any product or in anything that we're doing, kind of like you mentioned, whether that's designing things or whether that's, creating software or creating customer and user experiences. What has been, or if somebody was looking to really get into design or brand management or any of these areas, what advice would you give to them? Maybe somebody who's starting out or early in their journey in order to get into it or grow in their career or grow in their experience.
Well, it's pretty interesting because the pathway in can be very different. I mean, you can be a writer. You could be a strategist. You could be a data scientist. You could be a marketer, art director. Now you could be a technologist. It could be a developer. So I think that your pathway in can be very different. But if you're passionate about brand management and design systems and product design and so forth, those different paths do lead you to a similar place of creation, making things. It's sort of sometimes it's kind of magical, what you do because it's emotional. As a brand designer, you want to stir emotion. You want to stir someone's soul. You want to make something memorable, delightful, perhaps educational. But I think that the thing that, if I had some advice for someone along the way, along your journey, I would seek to work for what you believe in. And, I think to be in this game, you have to love it. And, cause it requires a lot of work, a lot of effort, and a lot of time, a tremendous commitment, to doing this thing well. So, but if you work for a brand or for a company, something that you really believe in, and that could be like lots of different things, but I think you'll find this type of work, this line of work, this industry, to be very rewarding. And so I think that the fact that we all come from so many different places, I think, is what makes this also rewarding for me.
Yeah, something that you believe in and something that you love. I absolutely agree with that. And even coming from a variety of different backgrounds, like you mentioned, can be truly beneficial both to your own experience and to the overall experience that we create. So I think that's great. Curt, this has been a really, really great conversation. And I have a couple of questions to wrap us up. But before we get there, where can people find out more about you, about the things you're working on now or have worked on in the past?
Well, I guess that's a great question, Kyle. I think a lot of my work is on, of course, our website, and VSA Partners.com. We're actually redesigning the site right now, so don't go maybe today, but you can go sometime, maybe in a few months. But we're going to put a lot of our work up there, and oftentimes it's like new work. But I think we're going to also feature some prior work that really helped define who we are and who we became. So that's great. And if you want to learn a little bit more about me, LinkedIn is a great spot.
Perfect. Well, we'll put the links in the show notes. And I love that idea of seeing both the current design and things you're working on, as well as maybe some of the things that defined anything from the past. I love that. Well, I have like I said, a couple of wrap-up questions, and these don't necessarily have to be design related or brand related, but have you read or watched or listened to anything recently that you'd like to share?
Yeah, there's a publication right now that it's relatively new to me. Like right before the pandemic, I was in a kind of a small bookstore, I think probably in the West Village, and this one publication really struck my eye. It's called Magazine B, and I had never heard of it before. It's a magazine there are no ads. And they each magazine is dedicated to a brand. So Magazine B stands for brand. But the approach to this magazine is sort of like a documentary in a book. And so, each issue, they feature someone different, and they pick brands. Brands don't pick them. They pick a brand that they love or a topic that they love, and they go really, really, really deep. And so I think the immersiveness of it is quite fascinating. Like this total dedication to this brand. So I mean, most of our favorite brands, like Mr. Porter or Lululemon or Airbnb, or there's niche brands as well, fashion brands. There's all kinds of, but they really go deep. And so if you're sort of a super fan of that brand, you could get like really rich material out of it. It's a really interesting approach. It's like a documentary in a book. And that's kind of the approach. Anyway, they're on issue 98 right now. 98 just came out. So there's a lot to choose from, but Magazine B, it's published in Korea, interestingly enough, and I think translated to English.
That sounds really interesting. And I haven't heard of them before either, but I love that idea of getting a really in-depth story. Like you said, almost like a documentary or a book in this magazine form of really in-depth analysis and probably history of these brands and some of these companies. I think that is awesome. I'll have to check that out. And final question, are there any products that you have been using or have used recently that you've either enjoyed or not enjoyed and want to give a shout out to?
Well, I think that I'm such a late adopter to technology, like seriously late adopter. It's like sometimes, I don't know. It's just like I guess I like seeing things adapt and develop, maybe before I dive in. But one that I'm really highly anticipating, and it's been kind of been discussed and talked about for some time, are the new Apple VR, the new Apple VR headset. I think that's going to be pretty cool. It's called the Apple Vision, and I just love how Apple designs its products. I love what those products provide. There's a tremendous amount of utility and beauty that are sort of so elegantly balanced in every one of their products. I've been skeptical on VR, extended reality, virtual reality, the different types of realities. And I think that, I've used some of the headsets that are out there today, and they're I don't know. I felt like it's not that they disappoint, but they, just as I was saying before, I have a different expectation now for Apple. I've got a higher expectation. I think they're going to really, I hope that they nail this. Because I do think that metaverse and Web3 and virtual reality, I think that's all tokenization, NFTs. I think we're going to see a lot of really, really interesting experiences. So I don't have one yet, but I'm going to get one very soon.
Awesome. I can't wait to hear more about maybe some of your experience with it, and completely agree that it is one of those probably defining products in a space, and will probably really shift how we approach VR and augmented reality, and obviously Apple being so good at many of these products. It'll be absolutely fascinating to see kind of where it goes from here. Well, Curt, this has been a great conversation, and I have thoroughly enjoyed so many of your insights and the things that you have shared with us. And I'm sure everybody who has listened has as well. But I want to thank you again for sharing all of that with us, and for spending the time. Thank you again, Curt, and we'll talk again next time. Thanks again for listening. If you like the show, be sure to follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast app. You can follow the show on TikTok at prodity.co and on Twitter at prodityco. You can also follow me on both of those platforms at Kyle Larry Evans. If you want more product conversation, check out my newsletter Prodity at prodity.co. You can also follow me on Medium at Kyle Larry Evans, or check out my Medium publication Prodity. Of course, you can check out all these links in the show notes.